The Alabama sun blazed merciless overhead as the crack of leather against flesh echoed across the Whitmore plantation like thunder before a storm. Ezekiel's calloused hands gripped the cotton gin's wooden frame until his knuckles went white as bone. His dark eyes fixed on the horror unfolding in the dusty yard beyond. Martha hung suspended between two oak posts, her wrists bound with rope that had already begun to bite deep red lines into her brown skin. Her cotton dress, once white as the bowls they picked from dawn to dusk, now hung in tatters soaked crimson with her blood. Overseer Cornelius Blackwood stood behind her, his face flushed red with exertion and whiskey-fueled rage. The bullwhip coiled in his meaty fist like a serpent waiting to strike again. 37, Blackwood called out, his voice carrying the lazy drawl of a man who had found his calling in cruelty. You keep count now, boys. Want to make sure this uppity negress gets every lash she's got coming? Ezekiel's breath came in ragged gasps as he watched his wife's body convulse with each strike. Martha had been caught teaching the plantation children their letters, a crime punishable by 50 lashes according to Master Thaddeus Whitmore's plantation rules. But Ezekiel could see in Blackwood's pale blue eyes that this wasn't about teaching. This was about power, about breaking the last bit of dignity that Martha carried in her proud shoulders and gentle smile. 38. The whip sang through the humid air and found its mark across Martha's back. She didn't scream, hadn't screamed since the 15th lash. Instead, she lifted her head and found Ezekiel's eyes across the yard. Even through her pain, even with blood trickling from the corner of her mouth, she gave him the slightest shake of her head. Don't, her eyes said. Don't do anything foolish. But something was breaking inside Ezekiel's chest, something that had been cracking like old leather for 23 years of bondage. He had been born on this plantation, had picked cotton until his fingers bled, had watched friends sold away like livestock, had swallowed his pride and his rage every single day of his life. But watching Martha suffer for the crime of teaching children to read, for trying to light a candle in the darkness of their ignorance, was more than his soul could bear. 39. Martha's knees buckled, and she hung limp against the ropes. A low moan escaped her lips, the first sound she had made in 20 lashes. The other slaves stood in a semicircle around the whipping post, their faces masks of forced indifference. They had learned long ago that showing emotion during punishment only made it worse, only gave the overseers more satisfaction. But Ezekiel could see the tension in their shoulders, the way their hands clenched at their sides. Old Solomon, the plantation's root doctor, stood among them with tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. He had taught Martha the herb lore, had shown her which roots could ease a fever and which leaves could stop bleeding. More than that, he had passed down the old knowledge, the words and ways that their grandparents had brought across the ocean from Africa, the spiritual practices that Master Whitmore forbade but could never fully stamp out. 40. The whip cracked like breaking bone, and Martha's body jerked one final time before going completely still. Her head lolled forward, her long black hair falling like a curtain across her face. For a moment, the only sounds were Blackwood's heavy breathing and the distant buzzing of flies drawn by the scent of blood. "Martha?" Ezekiel whispered, his voice barely audible above the mechanical groaning of the cotton gin behind him. Blackwood coiled his whip with the practiced motion of a man who took pride in his work. His white shirt clung to his barrel chest, dark with sweat stains, and his thinning brown hair was plastered to his skull. He had the look of a man who had never known a day of honest labor, whose soft hands had only ever held instruments of pain. "Cut her down," Blackwood said to no one in particular, already turning away. "Throw the body in the swamp. Don't want it to stink up the place. She ain't dead," old Solomon said, his voice barely above a whisper. Blackwood stopped, his heavy boots grinding in the red dirt. "What did you say, old man?" Solomon stepped forward, his gnarled hands shaking. "I said she ain't dead, Mr. Blackwood. She's still breathing." The overseer's face darkened like a storm cloud. "Are you telling me I don't know how to administer a proper whipping? Are you questioning my abilities, boy?" The word boy hung in the air like poison. Solomon was 70 if he was a day, had more wisdom in his little finger than Blackwood had in his entire body. But to the overseer, he was just another piece of property that sometimes forgot its place. "No, sir," Solomon said quickly. "Just saying she might live if she ain't dead, then I ain't done my job properly." Blackwood uncoiled the whip again, the leather singing as it cut through the air. This time it found Martha's throat. The sound that came from Ezekiel's chest wasn't quite human. It started low like the growl of some caged beast and rose to a wail that seemed to come from the very depths of hell. He launched himself from the cotton gin's loading platform, his body moving with a fury that surprised even him. But he had taken barely 3 steps when 2 of Blackwood's men grabbed his arms. Jenkins and Crawford, both poor whites who had found their only source of pride in their authority over the slaves, wrestled Ezekiel to the ground with clubs and fists. "Easy there." "Fuck," Jenkins sneered, his knee pressed into Ezekiel's back. "Your woman got what she deserved. Try anything stupid and you'll get the same." Ezekiel's face was pressed into the dirt, but his eyes remained fixed on Martha's still form. Her chest no longer rose and fell. Her gentle hands hung limp and lifeless. If you're finding this tale of supernatural vengeance as gripping as I am, make sure to subscribe and let me know in the comments what you think drives a man past the breaking point. The darkness is just beginning to unfold. They left Martha hanging there for 3 hours as an example to the others. 3 hours while the Alabama sun baked her blood into the whipping post and the flies came to feast. 3 hours while Ezekiel sat chained in the tool shed, his wrists raw from struggling against his bonds, his throat hoarse from screaming his rage and grief to the uncaring sky. When they finally cut her down, it was old Solomon who wrapped her broken body in a clean sheet. It was Solomon who carried her to the slave burial ground beyond the cotton fields, where wooden crosses marked the graves of all those who had died in bondage. It was Solomon who dug the grave by moonlight while Ezekiel sat beside him, still shackled, watching dirt fall onto his wife's shrouded form. "She was the light of this place," Solomon whispered as he worked. "Brightest soul I ever did know." Ezekiel said nothing. The part of him that could form words, that could express human emotion, had died with Martha. What remained was something darker, something that sat in the shadows of his chest and whispered of vengeance. It wasn't until dawn, when Blackwood finally unchained him and sent him back to work, that Ezekiel returned to the one-room cabin he had shared with Martha for 5 years. Everything was exactly as she had left it. Her sewing basket by the window, her few dresses hanging on wooden pegs, the small Bible she had hidden beneath loose floorboards despite the prohibition against slaves owning books, but it was beneath their thin mattress that Ezekiel found something that made his blood run cold. The root was unlike anything he had ever seen. It was roughly the size of a man's thumb, twisted and gnarled like a tiny screaming face. It was dark as midnight, so black it seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Strange symbols had been carved into its surface, symbols that hurt to look at directly, that seemed to shift and writhe when glimpsed from the corner of his eye. Ezekiel knew without being told that this was old magic, the kind that old Solomon spoke of only in whispers, the kind that had been brought in the holds of slave ships, hidden in the braided hair of stolen women and the scarred flesh of broken men, the kind that the masters feared above all else, for it was the one thing their whips and chains could never touch. As he held the root, images flashed through his mind. Martha's gentle hands gathering herbs by moonlight, her voice humming ancient songs in a language their captors had tried to beat out of them, her fingers tracing protective symbols in the dirt around their cabin. She had been practicing the old ways in secret, learning from Solomon, preparing for something, preparing for this. That night, when the plantation slept and the overseers lay drunk in their beds, Ezekiel made his way to Martha's grave. The earth was still fresh, still dark with moisture from the evening's rain. He knelt beside the wooden cross that bore no name. Slaves weren't allowed names on their markers, and pulled out the root. "I don't know how to do this," he whispered to the darkness. "I ain't learned the old ways like you did, but I swear on your blood and mine they're gonna pay for what they did to you." He bit down on his thumb until he tasted copper, then let his blood drip onto the root. The moment his blood touched the twisted surface, the root began to grow warm in his hand. The carved symbols seemed to glow with their own inner light, pulsing like a heartbeat. "Give me the power," Ezekiel breathed, his voice carrying across the cotton fields like a prayer to forgotten gods. "Give me the strength to make them pay." The wind picked up, rustling through the cotton plants with a sound like whispered voices. For a moment, Ezekiel thought he heard Martha's voice among them, calling his name. But when he looked up, he saw only stars burning cold and distant in the Alabama sky. The root had grown cold again, but something had changed. Ezekiel could feel it in his bones, in the way shadows seemed to bend toward him, in the way the very air around him felt charged with electricity. The old magic was awake now, flowing through his veins like poison and promise combined. As he walked back toward the slave quarters, Ezekiel began to plan. Blackwood would be first, had to be first. The man who had stolen Martha's life would be the first to pay. But he wouldn't be the last. By the time the sun rose over the Whitmore plantation, painting the cotton fields gold in the morning light, Ezekiel had made his choice. He had crossed a line from which there could be no return, had invited something ancient and terrible into his soul. The field slave who had picked cotton and swallowed his pride for 23 years was gone. In his place sat something else, something that smiled when it thought of Cornelius Blackwood swinging from the cotton gin rafters, something that could hardly wait to get started. 3 days after Martha's burial, the screams began. They started before dawn, high and shrill as a hawk's cry, echoing from the direction of the cotton gin. Ezekiel was already awake in his cabin, sitting on the edge of his narrow bed with the root charm clutched in his palm. He had not slept since Martha's death, could not sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her hanging limp between the whipping posts, saw Blackwood's satisfied smile as life left her body. But now, as those terrible screams split the pre-dawn darkness, Ezekiel felt something like satisfaction curl in his chest. The root had grown warm against his skin, pulsing with a rhythm that matched his heartbeat. Other slaves were stumbling from their cabins, pulling on clothes and rubbing sleep from their eyes. Old Solomon emerged from his quarters, his weathered face grave with understanding. Their eyes met across the dusty yard, and Solomon gave the slightest nod. He knew. Somehow the old root doctor knew exactly what was happening. "What in Sam Hill is that caterwauling?" came a voice from the direction of the overseer's quarters. Jenkins appeared, still buttoning his shirt, his face twisted with irritation. "Sounds like someone's killing a pig." The screaming stopped abruptly, leaving behind a silence so complete it seemed to press against their eardrums. Even the insects had gone quiet, as if the very air itself held its breath. "Cornelius?" Jenkins called out, his voice carrying across the plantation grounds. "Cornelius, you all right?" No answer came from the cotton gin. Jenkins grabbed a lantern from his porch and began walking toward the large wooden structure that dominated the plantation's workyard. The cotton gin stood 30 feet high, its peaked roof crowned with a weather vane shaped like a cotton bowl. During harvest season, the building would echo with the mechanical rhythm of the gin's rollers and saws, separating cotton fibers from their seeds with ruthless efficiency. Now it loomed silent and ominous against the star-filled sky. "Blackwood," Jenkins called again, more urgently now. "Answer me, damn you." Ezekiel followed at a distance, joining the growing crowd of slaves and the few other white men who worked the plantation. Master Whitmore himself appeared, wearing a silk robe over his nightshirt, his gray hair wild with sleep. At 52, Thaddeus Whitmore was a man who had grown fat and soft on the labor of others, his pale hands unmarked by honest work. "What's all this commotion?" Whitmore demanded, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had never been denied anything he wanted. "Can't find Blackwood, sir," Jenkins replied. "Heard screaming coming from the gin, but now he ain't answering." Whitmore's face darkened. Cornelius Blackwood was his most trusted overseer, the man who kept the slaves in line with a combination of fear and brutality that had made the Whitmore plantation one of the most profitable in Alabama. The thought of something happening to him clearly unsettled the plantation owner. "Well, don't just stand there gawking," Whitmore snapped. "Get in there and find him." Jenkins pushed open the heavy wooden doors of the cotton gin. The hinges creaked like old bones, and the sound echoed hollowly in the vast interior. The lantern light flickered across the gin's massive machinery, iron rollers and wooden frames, leather belts and metal gears all sitting silent and still as a graveyard. "Jesus Christ Almighty," Jenkins whispered, his voice barely audible. Cornelius Blackwood hung from the main support beam 30 feet above the gin floor. His body swayed gently in the breeze that whispered through the open doors, turning slowly like a grotesque weather vane. The bullwhip he had used to murder Martha was wrapped around his neck, its leather coils biting deep into his bloated flesh. But it was the position of his body that made even the hardened slaves gasp in horror. Blackwood hung upside down, his feet bound to the beam with the same rope he had used to tie Martha to the whipping posts. His arms were spread wide, lashed to a crossbeam in a mockery of crucifixion. His face, purple and swollen with blood, was frozen in an expression of absolute terror. "Cut him down," Whitmore ordered, but his voice shook. "Cut him down right now." It took 4 men with ladders and ropes to lower Blackwood's body to the gin floor. When they finally laid him out on the wooden planks, everyone could see that something far worse than a simple hanging had taken place here. Strange. Symbols had been carved into Blackwood's chest, the same twisted marks that decorated the root charm. Hidden in Ezekiel's cabin, the cuts were precise, deliberate, carved with surgical skill that spoke of knowledge far older than anything taught in civilized society. Around each symbol, the flesh had turned black as if burned, and the air above the body shimmered with an unnatural heat. "Who did this?" Whitmore demanded, his eyes scanning the crowd of slaves. "Who among you knows the old devil worship? Speak up now, and your punishment will be swift. Keep silent, and I'll have every last one of you whipped until someone talks." The slaves remained silent, but Ezekiel could see the fear in their eyes. Not fear of Whitmore's threats, but fear of what they were witnessing. This was conjure work of the highest order, magic that reached back to the motherland their grandparents had left in chains. Old Solomon stepped forward, his gnarled hands clasped behind his back. "Mr. Whitmore, sir," he said carefully, "this ain't the work of no living man. This here's spirit work, and spirits got their own justice." "Spirit work?" Whitmore's voice cracked like a whip. "Are you telling me ghosts killed my overseer?" "I'm saying some debts can't be paid to the living, sir. And when a soul cries out for justice, sometimes the old powers answer." Whitmore's face went white, then red with rage. He raised his hand to strike Solomon, but something in the old man's eyes stopped him. There was knowledge there, ancient and terrible, that made even a plantation owner think twice about raising his hand in anger. Instead, Whitmore turned to address the assembled crowd. "I don't care what mumbo-jumbo nonsense you people believe," he said, his voice carrying across the gin floor. "Someone murdered Cornelius Blackwood, and by God I'll find out who. Until then, no one leaves this plantation. No one goes anywhere alone. And if I hear so much as a whisper about spirits or conjure magic, the person speaking will join Blackwood in the grave. The supernatural vengeance has begun, and it's more terrifying than anyone could have imagined. Don't forget to subscribe and comment below with your thoughts on this dark justice, because this is only the beginning of the horror that's about to unfold." As the crowd dispersed, Ezekiel lingered near the gin, studying the symbols carved into Blackwood's chest. He didn't remember making those marks. In fact, he had no memory of the night at all. The last thing he recalled clearly was kneeling at Martha's grave with the root charm in his hand. Everything after that was darkness, broken only by fragments of images that felt more like dreams than memories. He remembered the sensation of moving through shadows as if they were doorways. He remembered standing over Blackwood's sleeping form, the man's snores turning to whimpers as supernatural dread filled the overseer's quarters. He remembered the feeling of strength flowing through his arms, strength enough to lift a full-grown man and carry him to the gin as if he weighed no more than a sack of cotton. But the details remained frustratingly vague, as if his mind was protecting him from the full knowledge of what he had become. "You did this," a voice whispered behind him. Ezekiel turned to find old Solomon standing in the shadows beside the gin, his dark eyes reflecting the morning light like pools of still water. "I don't know what you mean," Ezekiel said, but his voice lacked conviction. Solomon stepped closer, his weathered hands reaching out to touch Ezekiel's face. The moment his fingers made contact with Ezekiel's skin, the old man gasped and jerked back as if burned. "Lord have mercy," Solomon breathed. "What did you invite into yourself, boy?" "Justice," Ezekiel said simply. "I invited justice." "That ain't justice in there," Solomon said, his voice heavy with sorrow. "That's something far older and far hungrier. Justice is clean, Ezekiel. Justice is swift and righteous. What killed Blackwood last night, that was vengeance, pure and simple, and vengeance always demands more blood." Ezekiel felt the root charm pulse against his chest, hidden beneath his rough cotton shirt. The old magic was awake now, flowing through his veins like molten metal. He could feel it changing him, making him stronger, faster, more than human. But Solomon was right about one thing: it was also making him hungry. Martha deserved better than she got, Ezekiel said. They all deserve better than they're getting. If the law won't give us justice, then maybe it's time for something else to take its place. "And what happens when there's no one left to punish?" Solomon asked. "What happens when the hunger in you runs out of overseers and starts looking at anyone who's ever raised a hand to a slave? What happens when it starts looking at other slaves who didn't fight back hard enough? Ezekiel had no answer for that. The part of him that was still human, still capable of moral reasoning, knew that Solomon spoke the truth. But that part was growing smaller each day, overwhelmed by the darkness that had taken root in his soul. By afternoon, news of Blackwood's death had spread throughout the county. Master Whitmore rode to town and returned with Sheriff Calhoun, a thin man with cold gray eyes who examined the body with professional detachment. "Seen lynchings before," Calhoun said, spitting tobacco juice onto the gin floor. "But nothing quite like this. These markings, they're deliberate. Someone knew exactly what they were doing." "It's that conjure nonsense," Whitmore said. "One of my slaves is practicing devil worship, and I want him found." Calhoun walked among the assembled slaves, studying their faces with the calculating gaze of a man who made his living reading guilt in human features. When he reached Ezekiel, he stopped. "You," he said. "Look at me, boy." Ezekiel raised his head, meeting the sheriff's gaze directly. For a moment, something flickered in Calhoun's eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or recognition of something that shouldn't have been there. "What's your name?" Calhoun asked. "Ezekiel, sir." "Do you know anything about what happened to Mr. Blackwood?" "No, sir. I was sleeping in my cabin all night. It wasn't technically a lie. The thing that had killed Blackwood might have been using Ezekiel's body. But Ezekiel himself had been somewhere else entirely, lost in a darkness that felt more like drowning than sleep." Calhoun stared at him for a long moment, then moved on. But Ezekiel could feel the sheriff's attention like a weight on his shoulders. The man suspected something, even if he couldn't prove it. That evening, Whitmore announced that he had sent for a new overseer. Jeremiah Caulfield would arrive within the week, a man with a reputation for maintaining order on even the most troublesome plantations. Until then, Jenkins would be in charge, backed up by 3 new guards that Whitmore had hired from town. "I want double watches on the gin," Whitmore told his men, "and I want the slaves locked in their quarters after dark. No one moves around this plantation at night without my permission." But Ezekiel knew that locks and guards wouldn't stop what was coming. The old magic didn't respect mortal boundaries. It moved through shadows and dreams, through the spaces between heartbeats and the moments when men let their guard down. As he lay in his cabin that night, listening to the sounds of the guards making their rounds, Ezekiel felt the root charm growing warm against his chest. Images began to form in his mind. A man with cruel eyes and scarred knuckles. A man who had broken slaves on a dozen different plantations. A man who would arrive tomorrow with fresh ideas about how to maintain discipline. Jeremiah Caulfield. Ezekiel smiled in the darkness, and for just a moment his teeth seemed sharper than they should have been. The old magic was patient. It could wait, but not for long. Jeremiah Caulfield arrived on a Tuesday morning, riding a black stallion that snorted and pawed the ground as if it could sense the wrongness that had settled over the Whitmore plantation like a burial shroud. The new overseer was a tall, lean man with iron gray hair and eyes the color of winter sky. Scars crisscrossed his knuckles, evidence of years spent disciplining slaves with his bare fists when the whip wasn't enough. Ezekiel watched from the cotton fields as Caulfield dismounted and surveyed his new domain. The man moved with the fluid grace of a predator, his gaze taking in every detail of the plantation's layout, every potential hiding place, every angle of approach. This was not a man who would be caught off guard as easily as Blackwood had been. "Heard you had some trouble here," Caulfield said to Master Whitmore, his voice carrying the flat accent of Tennessee mountain country. "Heard one of your boys got himself strung up." "It was devil worship," Whitmore replied, mopping sweat from his brow despite the cool morning air. "Some of these slaves are practicing the old African nonsense. Conjure magic and spirit calling." Caulfield's laugh was like the sound of breaking glass. "I've dealt with conjure before, Mr. Whitmore. Seen root doctors and spirit workers on a dozen different plantations. The secret is to break them early and break them hard. Show them that their magic ain't nothing compared to good Christian discipline." The new overseer's eyes found Ezekiel across the field, and for a moment their gazes locked. Caulfield smiled, revealing teeth filed to sharp points. A practice he had learned from the Cherokee before their removal. A way of marking himself as a predator among prey. "That one," Caulfield said, pointing directly at Ezekiel. "He's got the look. The look of a man who thinks he's got power. I'll break him first." But as the days passed, it became clear that breaking Ezekiel would be the least of Caulfield's problems. It started with small things. Tools that were left in one place would be found in another by morning, arranged in patterns that made no sense to the rational mind but seemed to pulse with hidden meaning. The cotton gin's machinery would start up by itself in the dead of night, its wooden gears groaning and squealing without anyone to operate them. The sound would wake the entire plantation, but when the guards investigated, they would find the building empty and the machinery silent. Caulfield installed new locks on the gin doors, heavy iron contraptions that required 2 keys to open. The next morning, the locks were found hanging open, the keys inside the building, arranged in a perfect circle on the gin floor. "Somebody's playing games," Caulfield told Whitmore after the 3rd incident, "trying to spook us with parlor tricks." But Ezekiel could see the doubt in the overseer's eyes. Caulfield had expected to find frightened slaves cowering from his reputation. Instead, he found a plantation where shadows moved independently of their sources, where the very air seemed to whisper with voices of the dead. The cotton itself had begun to behave strangely. Bales that were stacked neat and orderly each evening would be found rearranged by dawn, forming elaborate patterns that resembled the symbols carved into Blackwood's chest. When the slaves were ordered to restack them, the cotton felt wrong beneath their hands, cold despite the Alabama heat, and somehow heavier than it should have been. "It's the conjure," old Solomon whispered to the other slaves during their brief rest periods. "The old magic is stirring, and it ain't content with just one death." Ezekiel said nothing during these conversations, but he could feel the root charm burning against his chest like a coal from hell's own fires. His transformation was accelerating now, his human consciousness retreating deeper into the darkness while something ancient and hungry took control of his body. He no longer slept in any meaningful sense. Instead, he would lie on his narrow bed and let the blackness wash over him, carrying him through dreams that felt more real than waking life. In these visions, he walked through the plantation as a creature of shadow and vengeance, his footsteps leaving no mark on the ground, his passage stirring no breeze. Martha was with him in these dream journeys, her spirit burning with a cold fire that illuminated the path of justice. She showed him the secret cruelties of the plantation, the slave women brutalized in the darkness of the barn, the children beaten for imaginary infractions, the men worked to death and buried in unmarked graves beyond the cotton fields. "They all deserve punishment," Martha's spirit whispered, her voice like wind through autumn leaves. "They all deserve to pay for what they've done." But it was Caulfield who drew most of the supernatural attention. The new overseer had made the mistake of moving into Blackwood's old quarters, a small house near the gin where the previous overseer had lived alone with his bottles of whiskey and his collection of whips. The first night, Caulfield was awakened by the sound of footsteps on his porch. When he looked out the window, he saw nothing but empty darkness. The second night, he heard voices whispering in a language he didn't recognize, words that seemed to crawl into his ears and nest in his brain like parasites. By the third night, Caulfield had armed himself with a shotgun and 3 oil lamps, determined to catch whatever was tormenting him. He sat in his kitchen chair, the weapon across his knees, watching the windows for any sign of movement. It was nearly midnight when the whispers started again, but this time they seemed to come from inside the house. Caulfield spun around, raising the shotgun, but the room was empty. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, speaking words in what sounded like several different African languages mixed with something far older. Then the lamps began to go out, one by one, despite the fact that their wicks were trimmed and their oil reservoirs full. Darkness crept across the room like spilled ink, and in that darkness, shapes began to move. Caulfield fired the shotgun at a shadow that looked like a man, but the buckshot passed through empty air and shattered the far wall. He broke open the weapon to reload, but his hands were shaking so badly he dropped both shells. They rolled across the floor, their metallic ringing mixing with the whispers that now seemed to come from every direction at once. "Show yourself," Caulfield screamed into the darkness. "Come out and fight like a man." The laughter that answered him was definitely Martha's, but twisted into something that no living throat could produce. It echoed from the walls, from the ceiling, from inside Caulfield's own skull until he thought his head might split open from the pressure. Then silence fell like a curtain, and Caulfield found himself alone in his kitchen with 3 dead lamps and the smell of something rotting in the air. The next morning, the other plantation workers found Caulfield sitting on his porch, the shotgun cradled in his arms, his eyes wide and staring. He hadn't moved from that spot all night, and when Jenkins tried to speak to him, the overseer just mumbled about voices in the dark and shadows that walked like men. "Maybe you should sleep somewhere else tonight," Jenkins suggested. "Maybe the main house has a spare room." But Caulfield's pride wouldn't let him admit defeat so easily. "I ain't running from no ghost stories," he said, though his voice lacked its usual conviction. "Whatever's happening here, it's got a natural explanation. Probably just some clever slave trying to spook us." That afternoon, Caulfield ordered all the slaves to gather in the yard beside the cotton gin. He had regained some of his composure, but Ezekiel could see the fear lurking behind his eyes like a caged animal. "Someone on this plantation is playing tricks," Caulfield announced, his voice carrying across the assembled crowd. "Someone thinks they can scare me with children's games and superstitious nonsense. Well, I'm here to tell you that Jeremiah Caulfield doesn't scare easily." He walked among the slaves, his pale eyes studying each face in turn. When he reached Ezekiel, he stopped and leaned in close, his breath reeking of whiskey and tobacco. "You know something about this, don't you, boy?" Caulfield whispered. "I can see it in your eyes. You've got the look of a man who's made a deal with the devil." Ezekiel met his gaze steadily. "I don't know anything about devils, Mr. Caulfield, but I know about justice." The overseer's hand moved to the whip at his belt, but before he could draw it, a wind began to blow across the plantation yard. It started as a gentle breeze, barely enough to stir the dust, but within seconds it had grown into a howling gale that bent the cotton plants nearly horizontal. The slaves huddled together, shielding their faces from the stinging dirt, but the wind seemed to avoid them entirely. Instead, it focused all its fury on Caulfield, tearing at his clothes and hair, filling his mouth and nose with red Alabama clay until he could barely breathe. As suddenly as it had begun, the wind stopped. Caulfield stood alone in the center of the yard, covered head to toe in dust, his gray hair wild and his eyes wide with terror. "That's enough demonstration for one day," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Everyone back to work. This supernatural battle of wills is reaching terrifying new heights. If you're as captivated by this dark tale of vengeance as I am, make sure to subscribe and drop a comment about which supernatural event sent chills down your spine. The horror is only beginning to escalate, but the supernatural attacks were far from over." That night, as Caulfield tried to sleep in the main house, having finally abandoned his quarters, near the gin, the plantation was visited by phenomena that defied all rational explanation. Every door in the main house opened and closed, repeatedly throughout the night, their hinges creaking like the bones of old men. Footsteps echoed through the hallways, sometimes sounding like bare feet on wooden floors, sometimes like the heavy boots of an overseer making his rounds. Voices called out from empty rooms, sometimes in English, sometimes in the African languages of the slaves' ancestors, and sometimes in tongues that predated human civilization entirely. Whitmore huddled in his bedroom with a loaded pistol, listening to his house come alive with supernatural activity. Caulfield sat in the kitchen, surrounded by every lamp and candle he could find, but the light seemed weak and ineffective. Against the darkness that pressed in from all sides, it was near dawn when they heard the sound that would haunt both men for the rest of their lives, the mechanical groaning of the cotton gin starting up, its wooden gears turning without human hands to guide them. But this time the sound was different. Instead of the steady rhythm of cotton processing, the machinery seemed to be struggling with something much heavier, something that didn't want to be separated from itself. Caulfield and Whitmore rushed to the gin, bringing half a dozen armed guards with them. They found the building's doors standing open, the machinery running at full speed, but the feeding chute was empty. No cotton was being processed, no seeds were falling into the collection bins, yet the machine continued to strain and groan as if it were working harder than it ever had during the busiest harvest season. "Shut it down," Whitmore ordered. "Shut the damn thing down right now." But when the guards tried to engage the brake mechanism, it wouldn't respond. The wooden lever moved freely in their hands, but the machinery continued to run. It wasn't until old Solomon stepped forward that they understood what was happening. "It ain't processing cotton," the old root doctor said, his voice heavy with dread. "It's processing souls. All the pain and suffering that's happened on this plantation, all the lives that have been ground up in the name of profit. The machine's trying to separate it all, trying to make sense of it." "That's impossible," Caulfield said, but his voice shook. "Machines don't process souls. Machines process cotton." Solomon shook his head. This ain't just a machine anymore, Mr. Caulfield. The old magic has gotten into it, made it into something else. Something that remembers every drop of blood that's been spilled here, every life that's been destroyed. As if responding to Solomon's words, the jinn suddenly lurched to a stop. In the silence that followed, they could all hear something else, a sound like weeping, soft and heartbroken, coming from deep within the machinery. It was then that Caulfield made his final mistake. Drawing his whip, he advanced on Solomon with murder in his eyes. "You did this," he snarled. "You and your devil worship. You turned that machine into some kind of abomination." The whip cracked through the air, but before it could find its target, every piece of metal in the jinn began to ring like a bell. The sound was deafening, overwhelming, a harmony of pain and rage that spoke to something primal in every human soul. Caulfield dropped the whip and clapped his hands over his ears. But the sound seemed to come from inside his head. The other men fled the building, but Caulfield found himself unable to move. Paralyzed by a terror so complete it had replaced his very blood. That was when he saw her. Martha stood among the machinery, her form translucent but unmistakably real. The wounds from her final whipping were visible on her spirit body, dark lines that pulsed with their own inner light. She looked at Caulfield with eyes that held all the sorrow and rage of her people, all the pain of generations born into bondage. "You came here to break us," she said, her voice echoing strangely in the jinn's vast interior. "But some things can't be broken. Some things just get stronger when you try to destroy them." Caulfield tried to run, but his legs wouldn't obey him. He watched in horror as Martha's spirit began to change, her gentle features twisting into something far more terrible. The other spirits were gathering now, all the slaves who had died on the plantation, all the lives that had been consumed by the machine of slavery. They surrounded Caulfield like a jury of the damned, their eyes burning with supernatural fire, their voices joining in a chant that seemed to come from the very foundations of the earth. The last thing Jeremiah Caulfield saw was a shadow detaching itself from the group of spirits. A shadow with Ezekiel's face but eyes like black holes in the fabric of reality. The last thing he felt was rope around his neck. The next morning, they found Caulfield hanging from the main support beam, just as Blackwood had been. But this hanging was even more elaborate, even more ritualistic. The overseer's body was suspended by a complex network of ropes and pulleys, positioned so that his feet just touched the cotton gin's main roller. Every few seconds, the machinery would turn slightly, spinning Caulfield's body in a slow, hypnotic circle. The same symbols that had been carved into Blackwood's chest were burned into the wooden beam above Caulfield's head. But this time they glowed with their own inner fire, pulsing like a heartbeat made of light. And written on the gin floor in what looked like blood were words in the old language, words that old Solomon translated in a whisper. "Justice comes for all who shed innocent blood." Master Whitmore stared at the message for a long time, his face pale as winter snow. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. "Send for Augustus Grim," he said. "Send for him today, but Ezekiel," standing among the other slaves, smiled with teeth that were definitely sharper than they had been the day before. Augustus Grim had a reputation as the cruelest overseer in all of Alabama. He would be perfect. Augustus Grim arrived like a plague upon the land, bringing with him an entourage of hired killers and a wagon full of instruments designed for the breaking of human spirits. The man himself was a monument to cruelty, 6 feet and 4 inches of scarred muscle and cold calculation, with hands the size of dinner plates and eyes like chips of flint. A jagged scar ran from his left temple to the corner of his mouth, a memento from a slave rebellion he had crushed in Mississippi 5 years prior. "Heard you got yourself a conjure problem," Grim said to Master Whitmore as he dismounted from his black gelding. His voice was surprisingly soft, almost gentle, which somehow made it infinitely more menacing than shouting would have been. 2 overseers dead, mysterious circumstances. Slaves getting uppity ideas about spirits and justice. Whitmore nodded nervously, mopping sweat from his brow despite the October chill that had settled over Alabama. The plantation owner had aged 10 years in the past 2 weeks, his hair gone completely white and deep lines etched around his eyes. Sleep had become a stranger to him, chased away by the sounds that echoed from the cotton gin each night. Sounds of machinery running without operators, of voices calling out in languages that predated Christianity. "I need order restored," Whitmore said. "I need these slaves reminded of their place. Whatever's happening here, whatever devil worship they're practicing, it has to stop." Grim smiled, revealing teeth stained brown with tobacco juice. Order is my specialty, Mr. Whitmore. Had a plantation down in Louisiana where the slaves thought they could hex me with chicken bones and graveyard dirt. Took me 3 days to break their spirit completely. Haven't had a lick of trouble since. The new overseer's pale eyes scanned the assembled slaves, taking in every detail with the calculating gaze of a man who made his living reading weakness in human faces. When his gaze fell on Ezekiel, something flickered in those cold depths. Recognition, perhaps, or the predator's instinct for identifying the most dangerous prey. But if Grim expected to see fear in Ezekiel's dark eyes, he was disappointed. What he found instead was something far more unsettling, a complete absence of human emotion, as if he were looking into the eyes of a corpse that hadn't yet realized it was dead. That one, Grim said, pointing directly at Ezekiel. He's the source. I can smell the conjure on him from here. Old Solomon stepped forward, his weathered hands clasped behind his back. Mr. Grim, sir, with respect, you might want to be careful about. The blow came so fast that nobody saw it coming. Grim's massive fist caught Solomon in the stomach, doubling the old root doctor over and sending him crashing to the red dirt. The sound of the impact echoed across the plantation yard like a gunshot. I don't recall asking for your opinion, old man, Grim said in that same soft, gentle voice. In fact, I don't recall giving anyone permission to speak at all. He walked among the slaves like a general reviewing troops, his heavy boots grinding in the dirt with each step. Behind him came his men, Jenkins and Crawford, the surviving plantation guards, along with 3 new faces recruited from the worst taverns in Montgomery. Men who had found their calling in the infliction of pain, who wore their cruelty like badges of honor. Here's how things are going to work from now on, Grim announced, his voice carrying easily across the yard. First, there will be no more gatherings after dark. No singing, no storytelling, no passing around of folk remedies or charms. Anyone caught practicing conjure magic will be shot on sight. A murmur of fear rippled through the assembled slaves, but Ezekiel remained silent. He could feel the root charm burning against his chest like a brand, its ancient power responding to the threat with barely contained violence. The shadows around him seemed to deepen, stretching longer than they should have given the position of the sun. Second, Grim continued, work quotas are being doubled effective immediately. Every slave will pick 200 pounds of cotton per day or face 20 lashes. No exceptions, no excuses. 200 pounds was an impossible quota. Even the strongest field hands rarely managed more than 150 pounds in a full day of backbreaking labor. It was a death sentence disguised as increased productivity, designed to break spirits as much as bodies. Third, anyone who so much as looks at me wrong will wish they had never been born. I've broken stronger men than you, and I've broken them so completely that they thanked me for the privilege. As Grim spoke, the very air around the plantation seemed to grow heavier, charged with an electricity that made everyone's skin crawl. The cotton plants in the nearby fields began to rustle despite the absence of any wind, their white bowls turning slowly on their stems as if following some unheard music. But it was the cotton gin that showed the most dramatic change. The massive wooden structure had begun to emit a low humming sound, barely audible but felt in the bones of everyone present. The weather vane on its peak, the one shaped like a cotton bowl, was spinning slowly despite the still air, turning in a direction that defied the laws of physics. You hear that? Grim asked, tilting his head toward the gin. That's the sound of machinery that wants to be used. That's the sound of a building that remembers what it was built for. He walked closer to the gin, his hand resting on the whip coiled at his belt. I know what happened to Blackwood and Caulfield. They were weak men, soft men who let superstition cloud their judgment. But I'm different. I've seen real magic, the kind that flows in blood and screams, and I know how to turn it to my advantage. Ezekiel felt something stir deep in his chest, not the human emotion of anger, but something far more primal and dangerous. The root charm was responding to Grim's words, its ancient power recognizing a true threat to its plans for vengeance. You want to play with conjure magic? Grim called out, his voice echoing off the gin's wooden walls. You want to summon spirits and call down curses? Well, I'm here to tell you that Augustus Grim has seen it all before, and Augustus Grim is still standing. The humming from the gin grew louder, rising in pitch until it sounded almost like singing, a chorus of voices raised in a harmony that spoke of pain and loss and the hunger for justice. The wooden walls began to vibrate, and dust trickled down from the rafters like snow. But Grim showed no fear. Instead, he smiled that cold, predatory smile and drew his whip with a practiced motion. "First lesson starts now," he said, his eyes finding Ezekiel in the crowd. "You there, conjure man? Step forward." Ezekiel moved through the crowd of slaves like a shadow given form. His feet made no sound on the hard-packed dirt, and the other slaves seemed to unconsciously step aside to let him pass. When he reached the space in front of Grim, the two men faced each other like opposing forces of nature, one representing the old cruelties of human bondage, the other something far older and infinitely more dangerous. "Strip," Grim commanded. "I want everyone to see what happens to slaves who think they can practice devil worship on my plantation." Ezekiel began to remove his rough cotton shirt, but as the fabric fell away, gasps arose from the assembled crowd. His chest and arms were covered in symbols, not carved into the skin like the marks found on the dead overseers, but somehow burned into his very flesh. They glowed with a faint inner light, pulsing in rhythm with his heartbeat, and the air around them shimmered with supernatural heat. "Well, well," Grim said, his voice filled with genuine interest. "Looks like we've got ourselves a real practitioner here. That's some fine work, boy. Who taught you to mark yourself like that?" "The spirits taught me," Ezekiel said, his voice carrying an odd harmonic quality as if multiple people were speaking in perfect unison. "The spirits of all those who died in chains, all those who cried out for justice and received only more pain." Grim's whip uncoiled like a striking snake, but when the leather cracked through the air toward Ezekiel's marked chest, something impossible happened. The whip stopped in midair, frozen as if it had struck an invisible wall. Grim pulled harder, putting all his considerable strength behind the effort, but the weapon refused to move another inch. "Parlor tricks," Grim snarled, but there was uncertainty in his voice now. "Clever illusions, nothing more." He released the whip and drew a knife instead, a wicked blade with a bone handle carved from what looked suspiciously like human remains. But as he lunged forward, Ezekiel simply stepped to one side, not quickly, not with any apparent effort, but with the fluid grace of smoke drifting on a breeze. The knife passed through empty air, and Grim found himself stumbling forward, off balance and suddenly aware that he was no longer dealing with an ordinary slave. "Your turn is coming," Ezekiel said, his black eyes reflecting no light at all. "But not today. Today, you get to live with the knowledge that your death is already written. You get to feel what it's like to be afraid." And then between one heartbeat and the next, Ezekiel was gone. Not fled, not hidden, simply absent as if he had never been there at all. The only evidence of his presence was the whip, still hanging motionless in the air where it had been stopped, and a scent in the air like burning cedar and graveyard earth. Grim stared at the spot where Ezekiel had been standing, his scarred face pale with something that might have been fear. Around them, the slaves began to whisper among themselves, their voices carrying a mixture of terror and hope that hadn't been heard on the plantation since Martha's death. "Back to work," Grim shouted, his voice cracking slightly. "All of you back to work. Anyone caught talking about what just happened will face 50 lashes." But even as the slaves dispersed to their various duties, everyone could feel that something fundamental had changed. The balance of power on the plantation had shifted, and Augustus Grim, for all his reputation and cruelty, was no longer the most dangerous predator in these cotton fields. The supernatural confrontation has reached a terrifying new level. The very fabric of reality seems to be unraveling on this cursed plantation. Subscribe now and tell me in the comments, do you think Grim will survive what's coming for him? The darkness is about to claim another victim. That night, as Grim tried to sleep in the main house, he had been warned about the fate of overseers who stayed in the quarters near the gin. The plantation began its nightly descent into supernatural chaos. But this time, the phenomena were more focused, more personal, as if the very spirits of the damned had decided to concentrate their attention on one specific target. It started with whispers in the walls, voices speaking in languages that predated the arrival of Europeans on the American continent. The words were unintelligible, but their meaning was crystal clear. Threats, promises of vengeance, descriptions of torments that would make earthly punishment seem like gentle caresses. Grim sat in the kitchen with every lamp in the house burning, a loaded shotgun across his knees and a bottle of whiskey at his elbow. He had been in situations like this before, so he told himself. He had faced down conjure men and root doctors, had broken their spells with superior firepower and absolute ruthlessness. But this felt different. This felt like something that had moved beyond human magic into realms that no living man was meant to explore. The temperature in the house began to drop. Despite the fact that fires burned in 3 different fireplaces, frost began to form on the inside of the windows, delicate patterns that looked disturbingly like the symbols that had been burned into Ezekiel's chest. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and now they seemed to be coming from multiple directions at once. Then the shadows began to move. At first, Grim thought it was just his imagination, the product of stress and too much whiskey. But as he watched, the shadows cast by the lamp flames began to writhe and twist independently of their sources. They reached across the walls like grasping fingers stretching toward him with obvious malevolent intent. "Come on then," Grim shouted, raising the shotgun. "Whatever you are, wherever you're hiding, come out and face me like a man." The laughter that answered him was definitely Martha's voice, but twisted into something that no human throat could produce. It echoed from every surface in the room, bouncing off walls and ceiling until it seemed to come from inside Grim's own skull. Then she appeared. Not gradually, not fading in like morning mist, but suddenly and completely, as if she had always been standing there in the corner of the kitchen. Martha's spirit was more solid now than it had been during previous manifestations, her form crackling with supernatural energy that made the air around her shimmer like heat waves. "You came here to break us," she said, her voice carrying the weight of generations of suffering. "You came here thinking you could use fear and pain to make us forget who we are, to make us forget that we're human beings with souls worth saving." Grim fired the shotgun directly at her, but the buckshot passed through her form without effect, embedding itself in the kitchen wall behind her. She smiled at his futile gesture, her teeth gleaming white in the lamplight. "But some things can't be broken," Martha continued. "Some things just get stronger when you try to destroy them. Love gets stronger, hope gets stronger, and justice." Her form began to glow brighter until looking at her directly became painful. "Justice gets hungrier." More spirits began to appear around the edges of the room, dozens of them, the ghosts of slaves who had died on the plantation over the decades. Men, women, children, all bearing the marks of the violence that had ended their lives. They stood in silent judgment, their eyes burning with the fire of the righteously wronged. "You want to know about real power?" Martha asked, floating closer to Grim's chair. "You want to understand the kind of magic that flows in blood and tears? Let me show you what happens when the dead refuse to stay buried." The lamp flame suddenly flared higher, casting wild shadows that danced across the walls like demons celebrating some unholy festival. The temperature continued to drop until Grim's breath came out in visible puffs, and ice began to form on the surface of his whiskey bottle. But it was the sound that finally broke his nerve, the mechanical groaning of the cotton gin starting up, its wooden gears turning in the darkness outside. The sound was different tonight, more urgent, as if the machine had found something particularly satisfying to process. "No," Grim whispered, his voice barely audible above the supernatural cacophony. "This isn't real. This isn't possible." "Reality is what we make it," Martha said, her spirit now blazing like a star, "and we've made this place into something that remembers every injustice, every cruelty, every drop of innocent blood spilled in the name of profit." The kitchen door slammed open, though no wind stirred the air outside. Through the doorway, Grim could see the cotton gin in the distance, its windows glowing with the same supernatural fire that surrounded Martha's spirit. The machinery was running at full speed now, processing something that made it strain and groan with effort. "Go," Martha commanded, her voice echoing with authority that brooked no disobedience. "Go and see what justice looks like when it's been too long denied." Against his will, against every instinct for self-preservation he had developed over years of violence and cruelty, Grim found himself standing up from his chair. His legs moved without his conscious command, carrying him toward the open door and the nightmare that waited beyond. Behind him, the spirits of the dead followed in silent procession, their ghostly forms casting no shadows but radiating a cold that seemed to freeze the very air in his lungs. The walk to the cotton gin felt like a journey through purgatory. With each step, Grim became more aware of the weight of his crimes, the lives he had destroyed, the families he had torn apart in the name of maintaining order. The spirits whispered to him as he walked, telling him the names of their children, describing the dreams they had harbored before those dreams were ground up in the machinery of slavery. By the time he reached the djinn, Augustus Grim was weeping, not from fear, though terror certainly coursed through his veins, but from a grief so profound it seemed to hollow out his very soul. For the first time in his life, he understood the true cost of the system he had served so faithfully. The djinn's doors stood open, revealing the massive machinery inside. But tonight, the wooden gears and iron rollers seemed to pulse with their own heartbeat, and the very air inside the building sparkled with supernatural energy. Standing among the machinery, his form now more shadow than substance, was Ezekiel. But this was not the broken slave who had picked cotton for 23 years. This was something far more ancient and terrible, a vessel for all the rage and pain of his people, a conduit for justice long delayed. "Welcome to your judgment," Ezekiel said, his voice echoing strangely in the djinn's vast interior. "Welcome to the place where accounts are finally settled." The last thing Augustus Grim saw before the darkness claimed him was rope descending from the rafters, moving with serpentine intelligence, reaching for his throat with the patience of eternity itself. The last thing he heard was the cotton djinn changing its rhythm, adapting its mechanical song to accommodate one more soul in need of processing. And somewhere in the darkness, Martha's spirit smiled with satisfaction, as justice finally began to flow like water after a long drought. Dawn revealed Augustus Grim's body hanging from the cotton djinn rafters, in a web of rope so intricate it resembled a spider's masterpiece. But this hanging was different from the others. Grim had been positioned as if in prayer, his hands bound together, his scarred face turned toward heaven in a mockery of redemption. Carved into his forehead was a single symbol that pulsed with dying embers, the mark of final judgment. Master Whitmore stood in the djinn's doorway, his face ashen, his hands trembling like autumn leaves. 3 overseers dead in as many weeks, each death more elaborate and impossible than the last. The other plantation owners in the county had begun to whisper that the Whitmore place was cursed, that no Christian man should set foot on soil so thoroughly soaked in supernatural vengeance. "There's one man left," Whitmore said to his remaining guards, his voice barely above a whisper. "One man who might be able to handle this situation." Jenkins spat tobacco juice into the red dirt. "Who's that, sir?" "Every overseer worth a damn has heard what's happening here. Nobody wants to come within 10 miles of this place." "Solomon Murdoch," Whitmore said, the name falling from his lips like a curse. "They say he knows the old ways himself. They say he's fought conjure with conjure and won." The very mention of Murdoch's name seemed to darken the morning sky. Birds stopped singing, and the wind died to an unnatural stillness. Even the insects fell silent, as if the earth itself held its breath at the prospect of what was coming. Solomon Murdoch arrived that afternoon like death personified, riding a horse so black it seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The man himself was tall and gaunt, his pale skin marked with scars that formed patterns similar to those burned into Ezekiel's flesh. But where Ezekiel's marks pulsed with the warm fire of righteous vengeance, Murdoch seemed to radiate cold malevolence. His eyes were the color of dirty ice, and when he smiled, his teeth were filed to sharp points like a predator's fangs. Around his neck hung a necklace of what looked like finger bones, and his coat was sewn with symbols that hurt to look at directly. "Heard you got yourself a spirit problem," Murdoch said, his voice carrying the flat accent of the Louisiana bayous. "Heard you got a conjure man who thinks he can challenge the natural order of things." Whitmore nodded nervously. 3 overseers died, all hung in impossible ways. Strange lights in the cotton gin, voices speaking in foreign tongues, tools moving by themselves. "The slaves say it's justice, but I call it devil worship." Murdoch's laugh was like breaking glass. "Justice and devil worship ain't mutually exclusive, Mr. Whitmore. Sometimes the devil's the only one willing to settle accounts that heaven won't touch." He dismounted and walked among the assembled slaves, his pale eyes studying each face with the intensity of a man reading scripture. When his gaze fell on old Solomon, the 2 men locked eyes for a long moment. Root doctor facing conjure man, old knowledge meeting older darkness. "You taught him," Murdoch said to Solomon. "It wasn't a question." "I taught him herbs and healing," Solomon replied carefully. "What he learned after that came from somewhere else." "Where is he?" Murdoch demanded. "Where's the one who's been doing the killing?" The slaves remained silent, but Murdoch's scarred lips curved into a smile. "Doesn't matter. He'll come to me. They always do, once they realize they're dealing with something that understands their power. That night, Murdoch made his camp inside the cotton gin itself, surrounded by candles arranged in complex geometric patterns and bags of strange powders that smoked without flame. He had come prepared for supernatural warfare, armed with charms and curses that predated European settlement of the Americas. "Come out, Spirit Walker," Murdoch called into the darkness. "Come out and face someone who knows your true name." The temperature inside the gin began to drop, and frost formed on the metal machinery despite the October warmth outside. Shadows deepened in corners where no shadows should exist, and the very air began to thicken like syrup. Then Ezekiel emerged from the darkness between the cotton bales, his form more shadow than substance, his eyes burning with the cold fire of the righteous dead. The symbols on his chest blazed brighter in response to Murdoch's presence, recognizing an ancient enemy. "You're the one," Murdoch said, his voice filled with professional appreciation. "You're the one who's been calling down judgment on the white men. Impressive work, I'll give you that. But you're dealing with forces you don't understand." "I understand justice," Ezekiel replied, his voice echoing with harmonics that suggested multiple spirits speaking through his throat. "I understand payment for crimes committed." "Justice?" Murdoch laughed. "Boy, you don't know the first thing about justice. You've been playing with toys, calling up farm ghosts and plantation spirits. I deal with powers that were old when your ancestors first crossed the ocean." The conjure man began to chant in a language that predated human civilization, his voice weaving patterns in the air that made reality itself seem to bend and twist. The symbols on his scarred flesh began to glow with sickly green light, and the candles around him flared higher. But Ezekiel was no longer the broken slave who had buried his wife 3 weeks ago. The old magic had changed him, transformed him into something that existed partially outside the normal flow of time and space. As Murdoch's curses struck him, they seemed to pass through his form like stones thrown through smoke. "My turn," Ezekiel said. The cotton gin's machinery began to move without any human hand to guide it, the wooden gears turning with supernatural precision. But instead of processing cotton, the machine seemed to be separating something far more fundamental, the very fabric of reality itself. Murdoch's confident expression faltered as his own spells began to unravel, pulled apart by forces he had never encountered before. The powers he had spent a lifetime mastering suddenly seemed small and petty compared to the raw justice that flowed through Ezekiel's transformed form. "This isn't possible," Murdoch gasped, his pale skin growing even whiter. "No plantation spirit has this kind of power." "I'm not just a plantation spirit," Ezekiel said, floating closer to the terrified conjure man. "I'm every slave who ever died in chains, every mother who watched her children sold away, every man who swallowed his pride and died a little more each day." The rope appeared from nowhere, writhing through the air like a living thing. But this time it wasn't alone. Dozens of ropes, hundreds of them, all moving with predatory intelligence, all reaching for Murdoch with the patience of eternity itself. The conjure man tried to run, but the shadows had grown solid, trapping him in a web of darkness that tightened with each panicked breath. His charms and amulets crumbled to dust, his protective circles shattered like broken glass. "Please," Murdoch whispered, all his arrogance gone. "I was just doing what I was paid to do." "So were the overseers," Ezekiel replied, his voice now echoing from every surface in the gin. "So were the slave catchers and the traders and all the others who profited from our pain. But payment is due, and the interest has been accumulating for a very long time." The last thing Solomon Murdoch saw was Martha's spirit standing among the machinery, her gentle face glowing with satisfaction as justice finally claimed its due. The last thing he heard was the sound of rope tightening around his neck, and the cotton gin changing its rhythm to accommodate one final processing. When morning came, they found Murdoch hanging in the center of an intricate web of rope that defied all laws of physics, his body positioned to face the slave quarters as if in eternal apology. Burned into the gin floor around him was a message in letters 10 feet high. "The reckoning comes for all." Master Whitmore read those words and knew, with the certainty of a man facing his own grave, that there were no more overseers coming. It was time to face the monster he had helped create. The morning after Solomon Murdoch's death, Master Thaddeus Whitmore sat alone in his study, staring at a loaded pistol on his mahogany desk. Outside his window, the cotton fields stretched toward the horizon like an ocean of white, but now they seemed to writhe and pulse with malevolent life. Every shadow held potential threat. Every whisper of wind carried voices of the dead. His plantation was finished. Word had spread throughout Alabama about the supernatural murders, and no white man would set foot on the property. The slaves had stopped working entirely, instead gathering in the yard to sing spirituals that sounded more like incantations. The cotton gin stood silent and ominous, its doors hanging open like the mouth of some great beast waiting to be fed. Whitmore picked up the pistol, feeling its weight in his trembling hands. One bullet to the temple and all of this would be over. No more haunted nights. No more voices whispering his sins back to him. No more watching his life's work crumble under the weight of supernatural justice. But as he raised the weapon to his head, the study door slammed open without anyone touching it. Ezekiel stood in the doorway, no longer bothering to maintain any pretense of humanity. His form flickered between solid flesh and writhing shadow, his eyes burning with the collected fury of generations. The symbols on his chest pulsed like hearts made of fire, and the air around him crackled with electricity that raised the hair on Whitmore's arms. "Not yet," Ezekiel said, his voice carrying harmonics that seemed to come from the earth itself. "Your judgment isn't yours to decide." Whitmore tried to pull the trigger, but his finger wouldn't obey. The pistol felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds, too heavy for mortal hands to lift. Around the edges of his vision, more spirits began to appear. Martha, old Solomon who had died just that morning from a heart attack, brought on by supernatural terror, and dozens of others who had lived and died in bondage on this cursed ground. "You think death is escape?" Martha's spirit asked, her gentle voice now carrying undertones of cosmic authority. "You think you can simply close your eyes and make all of this disappear?" I never meant for it to go this far," Whitmore stammered, his face pale as parchment. "I was just trying to run a plantation to make a living. I didn't know about all this, like didn't know?" Ezekiel's laughter was like breaking a stone. "You didn't know that we were human beings. You didn't know that we had souls, that we felt pain, that we mourned our dead and dreamed of freedom." The study began to change around them, its walls stretching upward into impossible dimensions. The comfortable furniture of the plantation owner's private sanctuary melted away, replaced by the stark wooden interior of the cotton gin. But this was the gin as it truly was, not just a building but a temple to human suffering, a monument to the grinding machinery of slavery that had consumed so many lives. "Look," Martha commanded, her spirit blazing with holy fire. "Look and see what your business really was." The air in front of Whitmore shimmered, and suddenly he could see it all. Every cruelty, every injustice, every life destroyed in the name of profit. He saw children torn from their mothers' arms, sold like livestock to the highest bidder. He saw men worked to death in his cotton fields, their bodies buried in unmarked graves beyond the plantation boundaries. He saw women brutalized by overseers he had hired and trusted, their cries for help falling on deliberately deaf ears. Most horrifically, he saw his own role in it all. Not as the benevolent master he had convinced himself he was, but as the architect of a system designed to grind human beings into cotton and profit. Every comfort in his house, every fine meal he had eaten, every piece of expensive clothing he had worn had been paid for with blood and suffering. "No," he whispered, tears streaming down his cheeks. "I didn't know. I couldn't have known." "You knew," Ezekiel said, his transformed features twisting with contempt. "You all knew. You just chose not to see because seeing would have meant admitting that you were monsters." The cotton gin's machinery began to turn, its wooden gears groaning with the weight of accumulated sins. But tonight it wasn't processing cotton. It was processing the very essence of evil itself, separating the lies from the truth, the justifications from the reality. "Please," Whitmore begged, falling to his knees. "I'll free them all. I'll sign the papers tonight. Everyone can go free, I swear." "Too late for that," Martha said, her spirit form beginning to glow brighter. "Too late for half measures and deathbed conversions. Justice delayed is justice denied, but justice that finally arrives burns hotter than hellfire itself." The rope appeared from the rafters above, but this time it moved slowly, deliberately, as if savoring the moment. Whitmore watched it descend with the fascination of a man seeing his own death approach, unable to look away from the instrument of his doom. "Any last words?" Ezekiel asked, his voice echoing with the authority of cosmic judgment. Whitmore opened his mouth to speak, perhaps to beg for mercy one final time, but the only sound that emerged was a scream of recognition. Recognition of what he had truly been, what his life had really meant, what legacy he was leaving behind. The rope settled around his neck with the gentleness of a lover's touch, then tightened with the finality of absolute justice. As consciousness faded, Whitmore's last sight was Martha's spirit smiling with satisfaction, her gentle face transformed into something beautiful and terrible, and completely implacable. When the plantation workers found his body the next morning, hanging from the cotton gin's main beam, the sight that greeted them defied all rational explanation. Whitmore hung suspended in a complex web of rope that formed symbols of justice and redemption, his face peaceful in death despite the violence of his end. Around his body, carved into every surface of the gin, were words in a dozen different languages, all saying the same thing. Here lies one who profited from human misery. Let his fate serve as warning to all who would reduce souls to property. But it was what happened next that would become legend throughout Alabama and beyond. As the sun reached its zenith on that October day, the cotton gin began to smoke, not from fire, but from some internal transformation that seemed to consume the very memory of suffering embedded in its wooden beams. The smoke rose in spirals that formed shapes in the air, faces of the freed, dancing figures celebrating liberation, hands raised in praise of justice finally served. When the smoke cleared, the gin was gone. Not burned, not collapsed, simply absent as if it had never existed at all. In its place grew a single magnolia tree, its white blossoms gleaming like stars against the dark earth. The slaves had vanished as well, disappeared during the night like morning mist. Some said they had simply walked away, finally free to seek their own destinies. Others whispered that they had been taken up, transformed into something more than human by the cosmic forces that had answered their prayers for justice. Ezekiel was never seen again, though travelers in the Alabama cotton country sometimes reported glimpsing a figure walking between the rows at twilight, a tall man with burning eyes who watched over the workers in the fields, ensuring that no overseer's whip would ever again taste innocent blood. The Whitmore plantation was abandoned, its main house left to decay as a monument to the wages of sin. Local folk avoided the property, claiming it was haunted by the ghosts of the unrepentant dead. But those who knew the true story understood that the spirits who walked those grounds were not there to frighten the living. They were there to remember, to bear witness, to ensure that such horrors could never again be forgotten or ignored. Years passed, and the story became legend. The legend became a myth. But in certain circles, among certain people who understood the old ways and the new justice, the tale of Ezekiel and Martha was told and retold, not as entertainment, but as promise and warning combined. This epic tale of supernatural justice has reached its terrifying conclusion. If this story of righteous vengeance captivated you as much as it did me, subscribe now and share your thoughts in the comments. Which moment sent the most chills down your spine? Your engagement helps bring more dark tales like this to life. The cotton gin that had processed so much human misery was gone, replaced by beauty that bloomed eternal. The overseers who had wielded whips like instruments of divine authority hung silent in their graves, their names spoken only as cautionary tales. The plantation owner who had built his wealth on the backs of the enslaved faced the ultimate audit of his life's accounts. But the spirits of those who had suffered, who had endured, who had ultimately triumphed over their oppressors, lived on, not as ghosts trapped in the past, but as guardians of a future where such systematic cruelty could never again masquerade as civilized society. In the end, the field slave who had hung every overseer from the cotton gin rafters had done more than exact vengeance. He had torn away the veil of respectability that had hidden the true face of slavery, revealing it for what it had always been, a moral abomination that corrupted everyone it touched, master and slave alike. Justice had come to the Whitmore plantation at last, terrible and final and absolutely righteous. And in the magnolia tree that bloomed where the cotton gin once stood, those who knew how to look could sometimes see faces in the white petals, faces at peace, faces finally free, faces that would never again know the weight of chains or the crack of the overseer's whip. The reckoning was complete. The books were balanced. And somewhere in the cotton fields of Alabama, the wind still carries whispers of the day when the last became first, when the oppressed became the judges, and when cosmic justice finally settled accounts that earthly law had been too corrupt to address. The story was over, but its echoes would ring through eternity.